Welcome to the Econ Podcast Royale, presented by JJ Cunningham. In this episode, we will be discussing the Great Recession and the Great Depression, the causes, the effects, and the details of each event. To start it off, we'll be talking about the Great Depression, which happened at the end of the Roaring '20s, an era when consumer spending was at an all-time high, and people thought that the high and the great consumerism would never end. Spending was at an all-time high, and the government knew that people were living beyond their means and overspending, but people kept riding this wave, this kind of wave of happiness, all the way into jagged rocks that resulted in this economic crisis. This overspending came in the form of over-speculation in the stock market, which led to an immense bubble in the stock market that did not represent the actual value of the products and companies in contention. And this bubble obviously eventually has to pop, and when it did pop in 1928, the effects and the way that it affected people throughout the country was devastating. Because the US at that point had become one of the major players in the global market, the international effect was even worse, and countries like the Weimar Republic in Germany suffered even greater losses than the United States. But for the sake of time, we will not go into the international effects of this bubble. At the time, free market economics was the big name in town. But the big problem with this was, even though the government cannot run the economy for a capitalistic society, to prevent monopolies and to prevent businesses taking advantage of both the system and the people within the system, there has to be some type of regulation in place in order to prevent that from happening and to protect the people and protect from economic crises. And this kind of idea is one of the cornerstones of Keynesian economics, which is the idea that the intervention by governments can actually avoid these types of crashes. The responsibility in the Great Depression, at least, was definitely a principal agent problem. This is when one person can make the decision on behalf of another person, and the government's job is to protect its own people and to provide for its own people, as well as make sure they're looking out for the greater good, the common good, the public good. And when people are living outside of their means, spending more than they should be, especially during the Roaring '20s, ignoring the fact that people are living outside of their means and not spending responsibly, investing responsibly, and acting responsibly, this is when problems arise, and the government failed to regulate this and kind of slow down the spending and promote healthy investment habits in which people can still be gaining money and providing a great life for themselves and their families, while also not having the steep crashes and the disasters and the economic hardships that followed in the late 1920s. Though the government failed to prevent the Great Depression from happening, they did put a system in place in order to get out of the Great Depression. And though it took time, the New Deal was effective eventually in promoting America back into prosperity. War was also a major reason why the U.S. economy boosted back up and became a powerhouse once again, but for the sake of time, we won't be going into that. As a part of the New Deal, there were new safety nets in place, like the Social Security Act, that is still in effect to this day, as well as relief programs for people to build new infrastructure, get people on the ground working again, and hopefully get everyone working, everyone getting paid. And even though the country went further into debt, that debt eventually got paid off because people could actually spend money again and inflation was not so high. In addition to the Social Security Act and the various relief programs that the government proposed and enacted, they also proposed and went through with farmer subsidies. So these subsidies help farmers get a head start on all of the rest of the competition throughout the world as far as farming and fruits went, and then their prices would be cheaper within the States rather than having to import outside goods. And this was a time of great isolation for the United States as well. So people would be buying American-made goods, and this would promote the economy and keep money flowing through the American economy, both from the consumer and to the producers, who were the farmers. Though the Great Depression was, at that point in time, the most difficult and most trying time for the United States and its economy, it was followed by countless years of prosperity, success, and this success lasted all the way until the 2000s. Even though there were recessions and dips in the economy, none had been as extreme as the Great Depression until the Great Recession that happened in 2008. The Great Recession, also known as the housing crisis, was the collapse of the housing market when mortgage-backed securities such as CDOs, collateral debt obligations, fell through and failed because credit rating agencies, which were actually private companies that regulate banks, acted not in the public good, but in order to privatize and help their own businesses succeed as much as possible, because if they didn't rely on their loans, other companies would, and then they would be put to the wayside. Because of this conflict of interest within their own industry, these CDOs and mortgage-backed securities became subprime and became toxic assets. So their loans are assets that have lost all resale value, and these repackaged loans that are sold on secondary markets, if the loans or assets lose their resale value, that means these loans that have been sold on the secondary market are void and they completely collapse. And it's okay if really subprime loan collapses, something like a C, but there were A-prime loans that should have actually been C's and the absolute bottom of the barrel, but because of the corruption that occurred, mortgage-backed securities that were supposed to be great and were supposed to be sure things and easy bets actually became completely unstable and unpredictable loans that often were never paid off. And when these loans didn't get paid off, this is kind of when all the bubbles crashed, because there was the limit on when the loans had to be paid, and once that limit did not get hit, that's when the crisis happened. The consumers were easily tricked by loan sharks and these credit rating agencies that gave them very good loans, because they were not fixed rate loans, they were adjustable rate loans, and they took it easy on them. So in the beginning, these loans were very easy to pay off, but they were not fixed rate, so that means they could get hiked up at any point. And because they were taking loans that were outside of their means, because they bought houses that they could not actually afford, this caused people to actually be completely tricked. And when rates spiked, they could not pay off their house and they would have to foreclose, and this resulted in thousands of homes being abandoned, left, and the housing market to crash, and the rest of the story ensues. Concerning the government in this situation, the government allowed for the people to spend, once again, just like the Great Depression, to spend over their means, and for institutions to abuse the system at the cost of the people. They did not do their job in regulating ethical business techniques and investments. These ethical business techniques were nowhere to be seen by both the big banks such as Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and countless others, as well as the credit rating agencies that had to basically become corrupt in order to stay alive. People thought the housing market could never go down and that it would just continuously keep increasing throughout the country, not even in economic hotspots like California and Florida. But as all things go, what comes up must come down, and with free market economics, there will be ups and downs inevitably, just because of human nature and the unpredictability of how humans act. All things continuously draw to a greater medium, and where there is an all-time high, there will be a all-time low sometime after that point. It's the inevitability of capitalism and free market economics, and when people ignore that, they set themselves up for a bubble that will eventually break. If the market seems too good to be true, it probably is. Very few asked if it was too good to be true when the housing market could not crash and would not collapse, and the government failed to take action to slow the temporary good in order to prevent the steep fall to where the economy was naturally going to go. This is another situation where there were perverse incentives, where the opposite of what the government wanted or the people wanted ended up happening, kind of another way of saying unintended consequences. By becoming relaxed on the regulations on loans and mortgages, the government was assuming that this would boost up the housing market and help it even more, but the unintended consequence and the perverse incentive that ended up actually happening was a total crash that sent millions into economic failure and depression. Though the recovery process is still happening from the Great Recession, the government did do some things after it occurred in order to curb the amount of hurt and to promote the public good as much as they could. The most famous and notable, and probably the most controversial as well, is the Great Bank Bailout. And this was basically a multi-trillion-dollar bailout that is actually still occurring to this day, though very few people actually still know that. Many of these financial institutions that received bailouts had control of the economy for many, many years, and in the end, there were some companies that actually did not make it out of the Great Recession, but countries like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Chase remained through this, in part because of the bailouts, yet the government gave these financial institutions the money without forcing them to use it in productive and efficient ways. Instead of paying back the people who have invested in the company or given money to a company like Goldman Sachs, instead a few companies actually gave bonuses to workers and basically put it straight into their pockets without putting it back into the market and helping the consumers out. Another system that was improved upon after the Great Recession was the unemployment and welfare system. And unemployment is a temporary wage to help in between jobs if someone has lost a job, because many had been laid off from their jobs because of the Great Recession. And welfare is a safety net basically for people who need a safety net in order to keep surviving when a crisis happens. In the end, it's the government's job to try to prevent the worst from happening, and if the worst happens, to stop that from happening as soon as possible. As I said earlier, it is not the government's job in a free market capitalistic society to run the economy, but they must regulate it and make sure that companies are acting in the greater interest of the people and the economy itself and not trying to undercut the system. Both the consumers and the government must look past the temporary good and question, is this too good to be true? Because oftentimes it has to be too good to be true. And where there is those highs, there has to be some of those lows as well. And the government must regulate these ethical business techniques in order to promote a long-lasting good rather than a short up and down kind of spur. The greatest takeaway that should be seen from both of these crises is that the government has to regulate this economy. Therefore, regulatory agencies should all be ran by the government itself, because the government's job is to protect and seek out the best interests for their citizens. Specifically regarding the Great Recession, agencies that are rating the economy and directly impacting how people can spend and will spend should definitely be regulated by the government. The current system employs an insane system of conflict of interest, and in a capitalistic society, the government should try to eliminate as many conflict of interest as possible in order to prevent something like this happening. So in the future, regulating the economy to ensure that the people are protected rather than large corporations and businesses are protected. Thank you, and have a good day. A special thanks to some of the groups and websites that helped us gather some of this information and provide you with this podcast. equitablegrowth.org, weforum.org, investopedia.com, The Economics Book, and Naked Economics.